When I was a little girl, the smell of gasoline and oil was more familiar to me than the scent of flowers. The steady hum of engines, the rhythmic sound of a wrench tightening a bolt, and the oily black stains that never quite came out of my clothes. These were the things I grew up with. I was never one for dolls or dresses like the other girls my age. Instead, I spent my days in the garage with my father, watching him restore old cars with the kind of care that only a true artist could possess. My father, James Mitchell, wasn't just a mechanic. He was a craftsman, a master of his trade. There was something magical about the way he worked. Every car in his collection had a story, a history, and he treated each one as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The garage wasn't just a place where he fixed cars. It was where he brought them back to life. I was always by his side, learning the trade. I remember the first time I helped him restore a 1967 Mustang. My hands were small, but they fit perfectly in the tight spaces under the hood. I could feel the pride in his voice as he showed me how to properly adjust the timing belt or fix the carburetor. Every time we completed a project, he would look at me with that proud smile, saying, "Someday, all of this will be yours." Those words stuck with me, etched into my memory like the rusted metal of the old cars we worked on. He didn't just mean the cars, the tools, or the garage. He meant the lessons, the patience, the precision, the love for craftsmanship. He wanted me to carry on what he had built, not just in terms of objects, but in spirit. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about legacy, about something real, something lasting. When my father died suddenly at the age of 52, I was 16 years old. It was a devastating blow. I lost more than just my father. I lost my teacher, my mentor, the person who had shown me the value of hard work and perseverance. But he left me something. He left me his collection of cars, his tools, and that old lakeside property. I remember my mother, Susan, telling me that everything would be all right, that my father had made provisions for me. She reassured me that his will was in place and that the things he cared about would be protected for me to inherit. She said it with such certainty, with such finality, that I never thought to question her. After my father's death, everything changed. My mother, devastated by the loss, wasted no time in remarrying. Thomas, her tennis instructor, who was nearly 15 years younger than her, entered our lives with his own daughter, Emily, in tow. It didn't take long for me to realize that our house was no longer the sanctuary it once was. My mother and Thomas embarked on a whirlwind of social engagements, redecorating the house, and spending money on things I could never have imagined. Emily, with her picture-perfect life, became the center of their attention. She was everything my mother had ever dreamed of, a reflection of the life she had always wanted to lead. But for me, things were different. The garage became my sanctuary. The cars were my connection to my father, my way of holding on to the pieces of him that remained. I continued to work on the cars just as he had taught me. I spent my days in that cold, greasy space, restoring each car with the same care and precision he had shown me. It was the only way I could feel close to him again. But my mother didn't understand. She would walk into the garage with that look on her face, the one that seemed to say she was embarrassed by me. "Diana, honey," she would say, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Wouldn't you rather join Emily at her etiquette classes? It's so much more appropriate than spending all your time in that garage." Her words always stung, but I refused to give up on what my father had taught me. I didn't care about the glitz and glamour of the life my mother and Thomas were building. The cars were my legacy, my connection to my father, and I wasn't about to let that go. While my mother and Thomas spent their days shopping for Emily's new wardrobe and planning extravagant vacations, I kept my head down and worked in the garage. The other kids at school thought I was strange, a girl who spent her weekends covered in grease rather than attending parties or shopping for new clothes. But I didn't care what they thought. Every time I brought one of my father's classic cars back to life, I felt a sense of accomplishment, of pride. It was like my father was right there beside me, nodding in approval. But as the years passed, I began to notice something unsettling. The tools in the garage, the parts that had once been so carefully organized, started disappearing. At first, it was small things: nuts, bolts, screws. But soon it was bigger items. The vintage engines, the old transmissions, the parts we had spent hours restoring. Every time I asked my mother about it, she would dismiss my concerns. "We need to clear some space, Diana," she would say vaguely. "You can't expect us to keep everything exactly the same forever." I should have pressed harder. I should have demanded answers. But I was busy with school, with life, and I couldn't bring myself to believe that my own mother would betray my father's legacy. Then came the day that changed everything. I was in my final semester of college when my mother called me, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Diana, you'll never believe it," she said, almost too excited. "Emily is engaged to Bradley Worthington II. You know, the Worthingtons of Worthington Investments. We're planning the most amazing wedding. A country club, a 10-piece orchestra, 500 guests. Of course it's going to be expensive, but Thomas and I have figured out how to manage it." I forced myself to congratulate her, but my mind was racing. I could already see where this was going. "What do you mean you figured it out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She paused, a slight hesitation in her voice. "Well, we've had some interest in the lake property. Since it's just sitting there empty most of the time, we thought it might be best to sell it to fund the wedding." I froze. My heart sank. "You can't sell the lake house," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Dad's will specifically said—" "Oh, that old thing?" she interrupted. Stephen's lawyer looked it over. Apparently, there was some problem with how it was filed. Something about improper witnesses or incorrect paperwork. But as James's widow, I have every right to sell it. Really, Diana, it's for the best. Amber needs this wedding to secure her future. Your father would have understood." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if my father's wishes, the promises he had made to me, meant nothing. And just like that, in a matter of seconds, I felt my father's legacy slipping away. But it didn't stop there. The real shock was still to come. I would later discover that the cars, the collection my father had spent his life building, were gone. Every single one of them had been sold. Piece by piece, my father's pride and joy, his life's work, had been dismantled and sold to fund my stepfather and mother's extravagant lifestyle. And now, Emily's wedding. I was too young to fully understand the gravity of my father's legacy when he first left me with the cars and the house. But now I knew everything he had left behind for me was being taken away, piece by piece. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I would make sure that my father's legacy, his real legacy, would be protected. I would fight for it. The call from my mother came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. I had just finished a long day of work at the auto shop and was looking forward to some peace in the garage, where the scent of oil and metal still felt like home to me. The warmth of the old cars, the way they seemed to whisper stories of the past, was the only comfort I had left after my father's death. My mother's voice on the other end of the phone, however, shattered that calm. "Diana, you won't believe it. Emily is engaged. To Bradley Worthington, too." She practically bubbled over with excitement. "You know the Worthingtons, right? They're from Worthington Investments, a very well-known family. We're planning the wedding of the century. At the country club, 500 guests, a 10-piece orchestra. It's going to be amazing, but very expensive." I smiled weakly, trying to sound excited as she rambled on about the details. Inside, my stomach churned. I knew this wasn't going to end well. My mother always had a way of overdoing things, and Emily, her golden child, was the perfect excuse to indulge in all the luxuries she had always dreamed of. I could already feel the creeping unease in the pit of my stomach. The wedding plans were extravagant, sure, but that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the familiar, cold undertone in my mother's voice when she said the next words. "We've been looking into the lake property, and we've had some interest. It's been sitting there for years, unused. And with all the wedding expenses, it only makes sense to sell it." Her words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I froze. I hadn't expected it to come this soon, but in a way, I'd known it was coming. "Mom, you can't sell the lake house," I managed to say, my voice trembling as the weight of the words hit me. "Dad's will. He left it to me. He specifically said it couldn't be sold until I turned 25. Oh, that old thing? She interrupted dismissively. Well, it seems there was an issue with the paperwork. Stephen had his lawyer look it over, and apparently there was some problem with the witnesses. So, as James's widow, I have every right to sell it. It's for the best, Diana. You know, Emily needs this wedding. Your father would have understood. I felt a coldness spread through me. It wasn't just the sale of the property. It was everything that was happening in that moment. My mother, the woman who had always told me that everything would be fine, was now telling me that my father's wishes, his legacy, his love for me, meant nothing. It was all slipping away, piece by piece, to fund Emily's wedding. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it was as if I could already feel my father's memory fading with every word she spoke. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The lake house, the one place that held so many memories of my father, of us together, was being sold. My mind raced. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I had to stop this. I began searching through every email, every document, every scrap of information I could find. I searched for anything that might help me, anything that could prove that my father's wishes were legally binding. I found an email from our family lawyer, Mr. Patterson, confirming that my father's will and trust were intact. But I also found something that made my heart stop. A list of insurance documents for the vintage cars in my father's collection. I blinked in disbelief. As I went through the files, the shock hit me. Some of the cars, my father's prized possessions, were missing. The cars I had spent so many years restoring with him, learning from him, were gone. I couldn't believe it. How could this happen? I thought about all the hours we had spent together, just the two of us, working on those cars. They were more than just vehicles. They were the last tangible connection I had to my father. And now they were disappearing. I immediately called Mike, the mechanic who had worked with my father for years. He had been a friend of the family, someone I trusted. I needed answers. Mike, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to ask you something. Last time you were at the garage, how many cars were there? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mike finally spoke, his voice was low, almost regretful. Diana, they've been selling them off. I tried to stop them, but your stepdad, he said he had the paperwork showing they had the right to sell them. Your father's cars, they've been disappearing one by one. I'm sorry, I wish I could have done more. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The cars, my father's collection, had been sold without my consent. The collection he had spent his life building, the cars he had restored with such care and love, had been sold off to fund their lifestyle. My mother, my stepfather, they had betrayed me, and they had betrayed my father's legacy. I ended the call with Mike, feeling numb. I sat there for a long time, trying to process everything. My father's legacy was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do. Or was there? I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let them get away with this. It was time to take action. I had to find a way to stop them, to fight back. My father had worked his entire life to build something, to leave something behind for me. And I would be damned if I let my mother and stepfather steal it all. I contacted a lawyer I had met through Mike, Marcus Bennett. He was a lawyer who specialized in estate law, particularly cases involving family inheritance and vintage cars. When I explained everything to him, he was quick to assure me that my father had set up a trust to protect the assets, including the cars and the lake house. I hadn't realized it at the time, but the trust was there to ensure that everything was protected until I was old enough to take control. Marcus assured me that my mother and stepfather had no legal right to sell any of it, and that there were strong grounds for legal action. I felt a small sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The reality of the situation was that this would be a long, difficult battle, and it was a battle I had to win. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and frantic searching for documents. I gathered everything I could find: insurance records, photographs, receipts from auctions. I even started tracking down every person who had been involved in the sales of my father's cars. With Marcus's help, I began to piece together the full extent of what had happened. The truth was worse than I had imagined. Not only had they sold the cars, but they had also forged documents to make it appear as though they had the legal right to do so. It was all part of a plan to strip my father's legacy away from me, to erase everything he had built and leave me with nothing. I didn't know how it had come to this. I didn't know when my mother had stopped being the woman who cared about my father's legacy and started being someone who could betray it so easily. But what I did know was that I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything my father had worked for. I knew I had to act fast. The sooner I could get legal intervention, the sooner I could start recovering what had been stolen. But as I began to dig deeper, I realized just how deeply the betrayal ran. This wasn't just about the cars or the property. It was about trust. It was about family. And for the first time, I realized that family didn't always mean those who were closest to you. Sometimes, family was the one who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let them take this from me. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. But as the days went by and I continued to gather evidence, a sense of dread began to settle in. My mother and stepfather had gone to great lengths to cover up their tracks. They had forged documents, manipulated the system, and used every trick they could think of to hide the truth. It was going to be a long, hard road, but I had no choice. I had to stand up for my father, for his legacy, for me. And so, with the pieces of my father's past slipping away, I knew I had only one option left. I had to take control. I had to reclaim what was rightfully mine. By the time I had gathered all the evidence, the weight of the situation was almost unbearable. My father's legacy was slipping further away with every passing day, and I was caught between a sense of duty to honor his memory and the overwhelming emotions of betrayal, anger, and confusion that clouded my mind. But one thing was clear. I could no longer just sit back and let this happen. The decision to fight back had already been made, and now there was no turning back. I knew I had to act swiftly. Every hour spent waiting was another moment that my father's legacy could be lost forever. I called Marcus Bennett, the estate lawyer I had been working with. His voice was steady, calm, and reassuring, a stark contrast to the turmoil I felt inside. "Have you gathered all the documents, Diana?" he asked when I updated him on my progress. The evidence was irrefutable. The forged documents, the sales records, the receipts for auctions where my father's cars had been sold off piece by piece. There was no doubt that my mother and stepfather had acted fraudulently. "I have everything," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, as if saying it out loud made it more real. "But I need to stop them before they can do any more damage." "Then we move forward," Marcus replied, his voice resolute. "We'll file for an emergency injunction to stop the sale of the lake house, and we'll begin proceedings to recover what's been taken." The sense of urgency was palpable. In my heart, I knew that if I didn't act now, everything would be lost. My father's cars, those beautiful, timeless machines that had been a part of our lives for as long as I could remember, had already been sold, many to people who had no idea of their true value. The lake house, the last physical reminder of my father, was on the verge of being sold off, its memories fading with each passing day. The fight was just beginning, but it wasn't going to be easy. I was facing my own mother, the woman who had always been there for me, the woman who had taught me to trust her, to believe that everything would be all right. How could I have been so wrong about her? How could someone I had loved so deeply betray me so completely? I spent the next few weeks gathering every shred of evidence I could find. Emails, financial records, insurance documents, anything that could prove the extent of the theft. Every time I went through those records, I felt my heart break a little more. The sales of my father's cars were systematic, carefully planned. Each car had been sold for far less than its worth, and the proceeds had been funneled into my mother and stepfather's accounts. They had manipulated the system, using forged documents to justify their actions. They had taken my inheritance, my father's lifetime of work, and sold it all as if it were just another asset to be disposed of. And now, they were trying to do the same with the lake house, using the money to fund a wedding that meant more to them than honoring my father's memory. But I was determined to stop them. With the help of Marcus and George Patterson, my father's old lawyer, we began preparing for the legal battle ahead. George had worked with my father for years, and I trusted him completely. He was meticulous, a man who paid attention to every detail. He knew the intricacies of my father's will and trust better than anyone, and he was determined to help me reclaim what was rightfully mine. One afternoon, as we were going through the trust documents, George looked up from his desk. "Your father was very clear about his intentions," he said. "These assets, his cars, the lake house, the tools, were meant for you, Diana. And anyone who attempts to sell them without your consent is in violation of the law. We can't let them get away with this." The more I worked with George, the more confident I became. I had no idea how far this would go, how long it would take, or what kind of toll it would take on me emotionally. But I knew one thing for sure. I was going to fight for my father's legacy. I wasn't going to let my mother and stepfather erase the memories, the sacrifices, and the love that had been passed down through those cars, through the work my father had poured into his collection. The day of the confrontation arrived. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew I couldn't go back now. My mother, stepfather, and Emily had been notified of the legal proceedings. Marcus, George, and I were going to sit down with them in a formal meeting. I had no idea how it would go, but I was ready. I had to be. When I arrived at the law office that morning, the tension in the air was palpable. My mother, wearing her usual air of confidence, was already there with Thomas and Emily. They were dressed to the nines, a stark contrast to the weight I felt in my chest. The polite smiles and forced pleasantries didn't fool me. They knew what was coming. Marcus led us into a small, sterile conference room. George was already sitting at the table, a pile of documents in front of him. I felt a mix of anger and resolve. This was it. I was going to take back what was mine, no matter what. "Thank you for joining us," Marcus said, his tone professional. "We're here today to discuss the issues surrounding the sale of assets from the Mitchell estate, including the cars and the lake property. As you know, Diana is the rightful heir to these assets, and we are here to ensure that her father's wishes are honored." My mother, sitting across the table from me, looked uncomfortable but tried to maintain her composure. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice tinged with impatience. "James's will was never properly filed. We've already explained this. The assets were left to Diana, but there were legal issues. We've had to act on the advice of our attorney." "That's not true," George interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I reviewed the original documents. There were no issues with the filing. James Mitchell set up a trust to protect these assets, and it is very clear that they are to be held in trust for Diana until she turns 25. No one has the right to sell them, especially not without her consent." I could feel my mother's gaze on me, sharp and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Resentment, frustration, maybe even guilt. But I didn't care anymore. I was done being manipulated, done allowing her to use me for her own gain. The meeting continued, and with each piece of evidence we presented, I could see my mother's confidence crumble. She tried to argue, tried to justify her actions, but there was no way around the truth. She had sold my father's cars, had lied about the trust, and had tried to erase his legacy in favor of her own selfish desires. At one point, Emily, who had been sitting quietly, her face contorted with confusion, finally spoke up. "What do you mean, Mom? You sold his cars? Why would you do that?" Her voice cracked as she looked at my mother, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. I wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. She had been part of this. She had allowed my mother to pull her into this web of lies. But at that moment, all I could think about was my father, the man who had worked so hard to create something beautiful, something meaningful. He had trusted my mother, and she had destroyed that trust. She had stolen from him, from me. The meeting ended with a resolution to halt the sale of the lake house. The next steps were clear. My mother and stepfather would have to repay the money they had stolen from my father's estate, and the process to recover the cars would begin. But even as I sat there, feeling the small sense of victory, I couldn't help but feel empty. It wasn't just about the money or the assets. It was about the betrayal, the loss of trust, The realization that the people I had once loved had betrayed me in the worst possible way. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, paperwork, and countless hours spent in the offices of lawyers and investigators. But as I watched the pieces of my father's collection being slowly returned to me, I felt a small sense of peace. The cars were coming back, one by one, though some were long gone, sold to people who would never understand their true value. The lake house, too, was safe, its sale nullified by the court's decision. But despite all the victories, there was still a part of me that was broken. I had won back what was rightfully mine, but I had lost my family in the process. The cost of reclaiming my father's legacy was far higher than I had ever imagined. And yet, as I stood in the garage looking at the restored cars that I had brought back to life, I knew one thing for sure. I had done the right thing. My father's legacy would live on no matter what it had cost me. And as for my mother and stepfather, they had lost more than just my trust. They had lost the respect of the one person who had once believed in them most. The fight for my father's legacy was over, but the emotional toll of it all was something I would carry with me forever. Looking back on the journey that unfolded before me, it feels as though I'm staring at a lifetime, not just a single chapter of my story. I was once a little girl, filled with curiosity and passion for cars, something that most people around me couldn't understand. My father, a man who lived and breathed mechanics, not only understood but encouraged me to nurture that passion. In those quiet moments spent in our garage, I learned far more than just how to fix an engine. I learned patience, resilience, and what it truly meant to honor something, or someone, that you deeply cared about. My father's legacy was never just about the cars he collected or the lakeside property he had preserved for years. It was about the love and devotion that went into building something lasting. And for better or for worse, that was something I was determined to carry forward. When my father died suddenly, I never thought that I would have to face the cruel betrayal of my own family. I had grown up thinking that my mother, stepfather, and I were a family bound by love and respect. But as I grew older and faced the harsh reality of life, I realized that family dynamics aren't always as simple as they seem. My mother's swift remarriage to Thomas and her focus on Emily, her new daughter from this marriage, were just the beginning of a shift in our household. As they began living a lavish life, investing in things I couldn't relate to, I was left alone in the garage, holding on to what little of my father's spirit remained. The day I discovered that my father's legacy, the cars and the land, was being stolen from me, was the day I realized how fragile trust can be, even with those closest to you. I had always trusted my mother, believed that she would honor my father's wishes. Yet, when she began plotting to sell his estate to fund her new life and Emily's wedding, I felt my heart shatter. It wasn't just the property or the cars, it was the erosion of trust. The realization that my family had betrayed not just me, but the memory of my father. It was then that I realized how far people would go to serve their own interests, even if it meant destroying the things that truly matter. But this story is not just about betrayal. It's about the power of standing up for what is right, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. I didn't have the luxury of ignoring what was happening. The moment I realized what was being taken from me, I decided to fight. It wasn't an easy decision. The road ahead was full of uncertainty, pain, and the realization that I was no longer fighting just for material possessions, but for the essence of who my father was. The fight for my inheritance became something far bigger. It became a fight for justice, for integrity, and for the right to preserve a legacy that meant more to me than anything. When I contacted Marcus Bennett and George Patterson, I had no idea how difficult and complex the legal battle would be. I was up against my own mother and stepfather, people who had once been the closest thing to family for me. But they had stolen from me, and the truth had to come out. The legal proceedings were intense. Each document, each piece of evidence felt like a step further into the abyss of betrayal. Yet, with every passing day, I also felt a growing sense of empowerment. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that I wasn't alone in this fight. I had the truth on my side, and that truth would not be silenced. My father's trust had been violated, and it was up to me to ensure that his wishes were honored. The confrontation with my mother and stepfather was something I will never forget. I had spent years looking up to my mother, trusting her, believing in her love and support. To sit across from her in that conference room, knowing the depth of her betrayal, was a moment I had never imagined I would face. Yet, in that moment, I realized something. Justice wasn't about the money, the cars, or the land. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from me, and from my father. It was about standing firm, even when the people I loved most had turned their backs on me. When the legal decisions started going in my favor, it felt like a small victory, one that would bring closure to a chapter in my life I never thought I would have to face. However, even as I celebrated the small victories, the recovery of the cars, the protection of the lake house, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness. I had won, but at what cost? The emotional toll of the betrayal weighed heavily on me. I had lost the family I thought I knew. The people who should have supported me, who should have honored my father's legacy, had instead torn it apart for their own selfish gains. That hurt more than any stolen car or piece of land ever could. What did I learn from this journey? What lessons can we take from a story like mine? First and foremost, I learned the value of resilience. Life will throw unimaginable obstacles your way, and sometimes those obstacles will come from the people you least expect. But no matter how difficult things get, you must find the strength to stand up for what is right. Standing up for yourself, for your values, for the people who believed in you is one of the most important things you can do. It's not always easy, and it may not always lead to a perfect outcome. But it's the only way to ensure that you don't lose who you are in the process. Second, I learned that trust is sacred, but it can also be broken in the blink of an eye. It's important to understand that trust must be earned and maintained. Just because someone is family doesn't mean they have your best interests at heart. This doesn't mean you should stop trusting people, but it's a reminder to always be vigilant, to not take trust for granted. It's also a reminder to trust yourself. When my gut told me something was wrong, I should have acted sooner. Listening to your intuition can often lead you to the truth before it becomes too late. Third, I learned the importance of honoring the past, especially the legacies of those who came before us. My father left me more than just a collection of cars and a piece of land. He left me with the values of hard work, integrity, and the importance of preserving what matters most. As I fought to reclaim his legacy, I realized that it wasn't just about the physical items. It was about the love and dedication he had poured into everything he did. We all have legacies to protect, whether it's the memory of a loved one, a dream we've worked on, or the things we've built. And we must honor that legacy, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. Finally, I learned that sometimes you have to let go. Let go of the people who have hurt you. Let go of the anger, and let go of the expectations that family will always be there for you in the way you hope. Life moves forward, and the only way to truly heal is to acknowledge what has been lost, learn from it, and move on. I may never fully heal from the betrayal, but I have learned to live with it. And in doing so, I have found peace in knowing that I did what was right. So, what can we apply from my story to our own lives? The lessons are clear. Fight for what is yours, trust wisely, honor your legacy, and know when it's time to let go. Life is unpredictable, and it's often the hardest battles that teach us the most. But if we can stand firm in our values and learn from the pain, we can move forward stronger than ever. If you've enjoyed this story, if it's inspired you in any way, I invite you to support the channel by subscribing. Your support keeps me motivated to continue creating content like this, to share stories that are not only engaging but meaningful and impactful. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future.